Well, first of all, shifts away from energy-intensive, export-oriented, as Hu Tao was talking about, industrial production as being a primary focus of most of GDP seems to make a lot of sense. If you look at most models with respect to energy consumption, atmospheric emissions, or resource consumption of any kind and their sorts of emissions, you find that a structural shift away from industry into other sectors makes substantial changes. I should point out that industrial production sectorially in China at the moment accounts for about 49% of the total, which compares to about 35% amongst OECD and you might say middle-income countries as the sort of size of the component of their industry. The International Energy Agency, for example, showed that you could get something like a 43 to 45% reduction in energy demand by accelerating the shifts into the service sector and away from this export orientation. So this would seem like a reasonable thing to do, and in many ways it's enshrined, at least in name, within the 11th five-year plan that has just come out, talking about a de-emphasis away from GDP, particularly in heavy industrial production, and a movement to other forms of economic development. As far as urbanization is concerned, from my perspective, the cities are pretty well managed. Contrary to popular opinion, none of the major megalopolises of the world exist in China. As I mentioned, the cities are dense and relatively compact, and not tremendously populous if you compare them with Tokyo or Sao Paulo or Mexico City and others of that, or Karachi, not Karachi, or Mumbai for that matter, cities of that sort of ilk. That's not where the problem lies. The problem really does lie, however, in the conurbated and peripheral development areas around the cities, in the major watersheds in particular. In the Changjiang Delta, if one takes the from Shanghai through Suzhou, Wuxi to Nanjing or down towards Hangzhou, if you take out the cities themselves, you've still got a population of something like 30 million people and climbing, indiscriminately distributed across the landscape, under-regulated as far as the environmental activities are concerned, and grossly uncompetitive with respect to the inefficiencies of duplication of effort. To me, and you can say the same thing of the corridor that runs from Zhengzhou, for example, north towards Beijing, in the Beihai area, up towards the north, as well as in the south. Anywhere where there's this sort of conurbation starting to grow, it seems to me, that's where the problem lies, not in the cities per se, but outside of them. Access to housing is being, I think, reasonably well addressed, even though it's an issue, particularly with regulations which require 70% of all new residential construction to be 90 square metres or less. This tends to, as it were, soften the impact of luxury markets and speculation and so forth. Now, as far as environmental management technically is concerned, it seems to me a two-pronged attack or two-pronged strategy is in order. I mentioned these tremendous inefficiencies that seem rather inexplicable with respect to building and the fact that the water systems leak and all of this sort of thing. This, it seems to me, calls for bringing much of the kind of environmental activity in pipes, insulation, building efficiencies and so forth simply up to available international standards. You'd make a huge dent in the performance of China environmentally if you simply did that. It's like the advertising agencies say, going for the low-hanging fruit. In addition to this, I think there ought to be trailblazing and cutting-edge technological development. I agree entirely that China has a chance in certain sectors of environmental technology and of industrial production of becoming a major power and making it a major part of their economic engine. Community-level designs, like the one that Gary's involved in Dongtan, are certainly at the cutting edge of that anywhere in the world. And one hopes that there will be scaling effects so that you can have duplication, not just in one end of Chongming, but all the way across and so forth. The zero carbon building performances that we're seeing for high rises in Guangzhou, often engineered again by Arup, also are examples of this. Water harvesting in the manner, let's say, that's much more experimental of Singapore with the Marina Bay project strike me as being things to look at. Greenhouse gas capture and storage and supercritical plants, coal-fired plants for energy production are also areas in which China can make a big dent. There are very, very few examples of these sorts of technologies in the world, and in fact, about 25% of those that exist are being developed in China. It seems to me that they're not going to shift from coal as a primary source of fuel in the near-term future. It accounts for something like 63% of the primary energy demand in China at the moment, and it's going to stay like that for some time. So the question is, how the heck do you get rid of the CO2 if they're locked into that, as well as how do you make the plants more efficient? The other advantage China has is it's probably halfway through its urbanization project. There's another 300 million people to come, and judging from the kind of side-by-side and new district development mode of building, there's ample room to take on these new technologies and these better environmental technologies and build them in immediately into the new developments that are going on, as well as, of course, worrying about retrofitting the older ones. And this, of course, is a less expensive way of going for the new influx of urban population that's coming forward. All the way through, I think that there has to be an avoidance of what economists often refer to as high-level equilibrium traps. That is to say, you seem to be doing a good job, therefore you take your eye off the ball and don't worry about it anymore. I'm old enough to remember the environmental crisis of the late 60s and the energy crisis of the early 70s as an active sort of researcher into those things. We forgot about that, of course, by the time we got to about 1980, because there were lots of reasons where we could take our eye off the ball and things seem to be going quite well until we run into the situation we have today. So I think that is something that needs to be attended to. As far as governance is concerned, the command and control and then its translation into implementation at the local level is a very, very critical issue. There is the saying, of course, the heavens are high and the emperor is far away. That's no excuse, however, for an absence of local action in accordance with mandates and laws that have been in place. Greater support needs to be extended to MEP and SEPA. It has been grossly underfunded and underrepresented in the governmental politics of the country, if you happen to look at that from a ministerial point of view, as well as the Intergovernmental Reform Commission getting much more involved in trying to work out ways of coordinating individual ministerial activities so that they don't collide with the environmental agenda quite so sharply. And as far as this runaway train that I'm talking about in areas like the Changjiang Delta, it seems to me that there needs to be a considerable amount of more regional governance that's above the county, the city, and the provincial level in order to get one's arms around those kinds of activities. As well as tangible models, of course, to emulate. And last but not least, since I'm in education, real improvements in the human capacities in this area of urbanism, environmentalism, etc., the cross-disciplinary areas, in order to deal with these issues locally and in a precise sort of way.